schedule things because, again, schedule time to exercise a bit.
I know. Hello, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firesnow. And this is another Dump the Corruption show, and it's a continuation of last night's show when I was supposed to cover also the austerity issue once again being raised by the Republican Party. Okay, and of course, when I was also supposed to talk about the epitome of corruption, the one most needing a dumping of corruption, at least one of those most needing it, specifically Joe Manchin and his candidacy for the presidency. But in the intervening period, the recent interview that Crystal Ball and Sagar Angetti had with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, came to my attention. And so I thought that I ought to cover that in this episode as well. But let's do first things first. That is, let's start where we left off last time with the issue of new moves towards austerity made by Republican Party that is totally bought by the interests. So before I share that, let me just take a moment to share this video on Facebook, because that always helps a little. I think with attendance. Okay, so I'll do that. And now I'll move to the question of austerity. And I'll use the vehicle of a recent article in Common Dreams to talk about this. So here's the issue of GOP tax cuts and also GOP budget activity. Here is U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who was attending a hearing in the Hart Senate office building in Washington, D.C. on December 5th, 2023. Sheldon Whitehouse, of course, is Bernie Sanders' successor as the chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate. Headline is Senate Budget Chair rips GOP deficit hawks over trillions in tax cuts for the rich. Of course, they're not very hawkish when it comes to tax cuts for the rich. In fact, they're not hawks at all and don't mention to them the possibility of increasing taxes on the rich. They're just not there yet. Maybe they'll never be there. The tagline on this one is, quote, if not for the Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and then the Trump tax cuts, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio would be declining indefinitely, unquote, wrote Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. So I have to mention one particular fact that, okay, I mention always in this kind of context. Sheldon, of course, and the GOP people as well, are always raising the issue of the rise in the debt to GDP ratio as if that is a bad thing. And they all agree that we must be taking certain actions to make the debt to GDP ratio decline. The Republicans, of course, want to cut back, okay, on benefits, and Sheldon Whitehouse, okay, the Democrats want to increase taxes, all to improve the debt to GDP ratio. But MMT tells us, and not just MMT in general, but me in particular, in many of my books, we all make it very, very clear that the level of the debt to GDP ratio and also its growth has nothing to do with the fiscal sustainability of the United States. It is an entirely false issue. And the Budget Committee, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, is chasing its tail and being concerned with the debt to GDP ratio and representing it as such a great economic and political problem here in the United States. It is a serious political problem because these fools continue to believe, and some of them do, that the debt to GDP ratio, its level, is somehow important. I'm here to tell you it is not. It has no impact on fiscal sustainability. This article, though, was written by Jake Johnson for Common Dreams on December 8th, 2023. So it's more than a week old. I've been saving it for some time for use here. Okay. Democratic chair of the Senate Budget Committee rebuked his Republican colleagues on Thursday for demanding action to reduce the U.S. debt after adding roughly $10 trillion to it with tax cuts for the rich and large corporations. What else, right? Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, was responding to a letter he received earlier this week from Republican members of the Budget Committee who criticized the chair for dedicating, quote, significant time and attention to climate issues, unquote, while purportedly neglecting, quote again, the impending budgetary and fiscal crisis facing our nation, unquote. In a written reply, Whitehouse noted that if not for the Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and then the Trump tax cuts, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio would be declining indefinitely. Well, okay, I have to say that I would hope that would not be the case. In other words, if the Bush tax cuts were repealed and the Trump tax cuts, were repealed, and the debt to GDP ratio were to decline, as a result, if that were accompanied by smaller deficits, that would not be to the good. And the reason why it would not be to the good is because when the government runs a deficit and the foreign sector deficit remains the same, then there is an increase in the non-government sector surplus here in the United States, the private sector surplus. Somewhere in the private sector surplus is you and me. Therefore, all other things being equal, a very large deficit is of benefit to us and does not hurt the government of the United States to any extent at all. In fact, for money to flow into the private sector, the government deficit has to be as great as the current account deficit. In other words, the deficit that we're running to foreign nations, and also the savings that are being drained from the economy by the private sector here in the United States. To fund those two things, the government deficit has to be equal to the sum of those two things, equal or greater. That's just an accounting identity. And it's one of the major empirical laws claimed by MMT, because it's not simply an accounting identity. It's also an empirical hypothesis about what will happen in the real economy. If the deficit is greater than the foreign account deficit and the savings desires of the non-government sector here in the United States. So what am I saying in terms of numbers here? I'm saying that if the savings desires of the non-government sector 6% of GDP at this point, and the foreign sector deficit is, let us say, 3% of GDP, due to the desire of the non-government sector to trade, then the deficit of the federal government should be should be equal to or greater than the sum of those two things, which is 9%. Now, right now, even though people are complaining about how high our deficit is, CBO's projection of that deficit for this fiscal year is said to be only 8%, which means that there's no net gain for the non-government sector because the deficit won't be high enough. There's a further implication of that, and that implication is that there may still be a recession coming our way because the deficit isn't high enough. But we shall see. The Bush administration's decision, I'm talking about the government deficit now, the Bush administration's decision to launch the so-called, quote, war on terror, which received bipartisan support in Congress, also cost the United States upwards of $8 trillion. Brown University's Cost of War Project, has estimated. Of course, Sheldon Whitehouse has that top of mind because he's the senator, from Rhode Island, and that's where Brown University is. So he watches Brown University and what they do because that is the leading university in his state. White House described Republicans' proposed solutions, such as their balanced budget plan, as, quote, magical thinking, pointing to the Congressional Budget Office's recent conclusion that the GOP push to balance the federal budget within the next decade would not be possible without cuts to Social Security and Medicare, programs that are currently in the right wing's crosshairs. Here, I have to add, it might not be possible even with cuts to Social Security, and Medicare. And why might that be the case? Because cuts to Social Security and Medicare could cause a severe recession here in the United States. And what happens when there's a severe recession here in the United States? Then the automatic stabilizers kick in, and they require the federal government to spend more money than it otherwise would have spent on various aspects of the safety net, including unemployment payments start to skyrocket when we have a recession. And so it could well turn out that instead of helping to balance the budget, cuts to Social Security and Medicare could cause even higher deficits. In which case, of course, the Republicans would look at that and they would say, well, we didn't do enough cutting. We have to cut more. Because then we're going to see lower deficits. No, there are not going to be lower deficits from cutting more. There's just going to be a lot of suffering and a lot of unpopularity of the Republican Party. If they cut Social Security, and Medicare, they will be digging their own graves. Quote, that wild notion would zero out all other federal spending and still not completely eliminate the deficit, White House wrote, observing that the GOP balanced budget plan would require the elimination of Medicaid, federal nutrition assistance, and other critical programs. Certainly would, but it wouldn't really, because some of that could be made up by cutting military spending. That whole big target of more than $1 trillion a year right now. But of course, this would only exacerbate the fighting in Congress. White House also defended his decision to focus a significant portion of the committee's work on climate, arguing that quote, the next fiscal emergencies will be climate related and similarly disastrous for the federal budget, with cascading economy-wide systemic risks, unquote. Of course, Sheldon Whitehouse is right about that. And the U.S. has faced at least $23 billion extreme weather disasters this year, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee are currently investigating the climate-induced insurance costs. Whoa. Quote, we presented testimony from leading bankers, insurance CEOs, top corporate corporate advisory firms, mortgage lenders, and scientists about these risks. You responded mostly with mockery, climate denial, and fringe witnesses on the fossil fuel payroll, unquote, White House wrote Thursday. The Democratic Senator's exchange with his GOP counterparts came as Republicans and so some Democrats, like Joe Manchin, for example, are demanding a fiscal commission, quote unquote, to craft legislative changes to the nation's trust fund programs, which the GOP has characterized as key contributors to the national debt. And the article adds Social Security is not a driver, of federal deficits. Well, what I would say to that is that Social Security is no more a driver of federal deficits than any other federal program. I think all taken together contribute to the federal deficit, including, of course, the huge amount we spend on the military. Critics warn that a fiscal commission would be a Trojan horse for Social Security and Medicare cuts. White House and other congressional Democrats have proposed legislation that would extend Social Security solvency for more than 75 years by raising taxes on the wealthy. Republicans, for their part, have called for raising the retirement age while working to shield rich tax dodgers. Now, I'm not going to accuse the Republicans of being tax dodgers or their donors being tax dodgers. That's a loaded term that bears lots, of burden, to justify. I mean, they may be tax dodgers, they may not be tax dodgers. They may simply be taking advantage of loopholes in the tax law. That doesn't mean they're tax dodgers. They may be paying what they owe. Of course, I'm sure some people are not paying what they owe, like there's probably considerable evidence that Donald Trump doesn't pay what he owes. And there are probably other billionaires like that. But Social Security's solvency doesn't have to be increased by raising taxes on the wealthy. Now, I don't want to discourage raising taxes on the wealthy. I'm for raising taxes on the wealthy to the extent that there are no more billionaires in this country within 5 years. That's how I feel. But this has nothing to do with Social Security's solvency. You raise taxes on the wealthy because you want to destroy their capability to buy elections and to elect people who represent their interests. That's why you want to raise taxes on them. But Social Security solvency has nothing to do with that. That can just be ensured by Congress appropriating Social Security payments in full in each and every year from now until 75 years from now. That can also be ensured, well, I should say, directly, it can be only ensured by Congress doing that. But if what you mean by Social Security solvency, is the idea that there be enough money in the Treasury spending account to fully pay the bills for Social Security for the next 75 years. We can also easily do that, or the executive branch can easily do that, simply by minting a platinum coin with a face value that covers all the projected Social Security spending for the next 75 years. And then depositing that coin in the Treasury spending account in a special sub-account that can only be used by executive order to make payments to Social Security recipients. That's another way of ensuring the solvency of Social Security, but make no mistake, that would not solve the solvency problem by itself. It would still be necessary for Congress to appropriate Social Security spending in each and every year. The magic thing that ensures Social Security solvency is the appropriation of Social Security payments. It is not what lies in the Treasury spending account. Of course, there has to be money that goes into the Treasury spending account to allow for Social Security payments, but that can be done in the usual way that we normally do it, which is we can tax as we normally do, and we can issue debt instruments, as we normally do, and enough money will eventually find its way into the Treasury spending account that Social Security will be covered. But only as long as Congress continues the appropriations. Now, I've said a few simple things here. I don't believe those things are understood by the chairperson of the Budget Committee, Sheldon Whitehouse. I don't believe that these simple things are understood by the Speaker of the House. And those are very good reasons why both of them should be dismissed from Congress. The other very good reasons are, of course, that they both take big money from special interests. Both of them are violators of the dump the corruption rule. Going on, as we all know, the tax system is corrupted by special interests. It sure is. And million-dollar earners can pay lower taxes than plumbers and firefighters. Yes, they often do. White House wrote this on Thursday. And he said again, quote, some billion-dollar corporations pay no income taxes at all. When you are willing to engage seriously with this problem, of course he was addressing the Speaker of the House and the House members, let me know. There is a revenue side to the deficit problem, and we can correct injustices at the same time, unquote. I have considerable sympathy for that last statement, but there isn't a deficit problem in the United States. We are not running deficits so high that those are the cause of the inflation that we've been experiencing. The cause of that inflation was supply chain disruption, also price gouging, also lack of regulation, of business, Those were the primary causes of the inflation we had been experiencing. And another cause is the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Because in contradistinction to what the Federal Reserve thinks, MMT thinkers have now demonstrated that the raising of interest rates has actually been expansionary for the economy, which means the rising of those interest rates was contributing to the inflation that we were experiencing. How do you like those apples? Anyway, of course, the Republican Congresspeople are hugely corrupt, dancing to the tune of their donors, and they need to be dumped. But so do most all of the Democrats. So the next piece goes to the poster boy of political corruption in the United States today, Senator Joe Manchin. There's a picture of our poster boy now. He's conducting a Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee hearing in the Dirksen building on October 19th, 2021. The headline is Joe Manchin's entire political career should be treated like the scandal it is. It is kind of pervasive corruption. This kind of pervasive corruption in both major parties and all branches and levels of government shown to be normalized, says Basav Sen. Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, announced recently that he won't seek re-election in 2024, but he hasn't ruled out a potential third-party presidential campaign. And of course, if he does undertake such a campaign, he will do it with big money. He will probably run as the candidate of the No Labels group, which sometimes calls itself the No Labels Party, and which accepts large amounts of money from donors who see themselves or characterize themselves as centrists within the political system. Donors like the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, for example. Related organizations to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Joe Manchin will probably be their candidate because he is the poster boy for corruption. And that is what they like. For climate advocates especially, Manchin's career embodied the incredibly corrosive influence of fossil fuel money in politics. But solving that problem will take a lot more than one senator stepping down. Yeah, it's also going to require the defeat of that senator when he runs for the presidency. Because if he gets into the presidency, there will be even more incredibly corrosive influence of fossil fuel money. The outgoing lawmaker reportedly received more fossil fuel industry campaign money in the last cycle than any other federal legislator, and is himself a coal millionaire. Worse still, he leveraged his perch as the chair of the Senate Energy and National Resource Committee to enact policies benefiting his corporate donors and himself. Manchin was the architect of a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act requiring oil and gas leasing on public lands, and waters as a condition for any renewable energy leasing. He championed also provisions in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that subsidize risky, unproven technologies such as carbon capture and storage and hydrogen energy, which greenwash continued fossil fuel production and use. Perhaps his most infamous climate legacy is a deregulation bill known to the environmental justice movement as, quote, Manchin's dirty deal, unquote. After 3 failed attempts to pass it by attaching it to must-pass government spending bills, Manchin finally managed to jam it into a bill averting a government default. Manchin's dirty deal weakens our environmental laws and undermines the ability of communities to fight polluting projects using the legal system. The bill requires agencies to issue permits for the Mountain Valley Pipeline project without the customary review and public comment process, and exempts the permits from legal challenges. This is a life and death issue for frontline communities who pay the price for polluters' profits in the form of disproportionately high rates of cancer, asthma, and other deadly illnesses. And it has the industry's footprint and bank slips all over it. Manchin's fossil fuel haul includes a combined sum of about $66,000 from Mountain Valley Pipeline developers NextEra Energy and Equitrans Midstream. This, according to Open Secrets, a nonprofit focused on tracking money in politics, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who negotiated a backroom deal with Manchin to pass the legislation and appointed him chair of the Energy Committee in the first place, has himself reportedly received almost $220,000 in campaign contributions from NextEra Energy. Whoa. The big cheese there gets big money. Fossil fuel corruption is a bipartisan problem. Per Open Secrets, the top 20 recipients of oil and gas money in Congress include 3 other Democrats apart from Manchin, plus 16 Republicans. Yes, Republicans are truly the party of the fossil fuel industry, including former House Speaker Representative Kevin McCarthy, all took hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is also not a problem confined to the legislative branch. Among many other recent Supreme Court scandals, Justice Clarence Thomas reportedly attended a fundraising event hosted by the right-wing Koch network, even as Koch-aligned organizations have brought cases before the Supreme Court. The Koch family, of course, made its billions in the oil industry. In the executive branch, the push for false solutions to the climate crisis, such as carbon capture and hydrogen, has extensive support from industry-connected officials in the Department of Energy and other executive branch agencies. Corporate-backed corruption is a feature of state politics as well. A particularly egregious example is the First Energy bribery scandal in Ohio. Utility company First Energy bribed Larry Householder, the former Speaker of the Ohio House, and Matthew Borges, former chair of the Ohio Republican Party, to get the legislature to pass a bailout of its failing coal and nuclear plants to be paid by Ohio ratepayers in the form of higher bills. While Householder and Borges are now in prison, First Energy has faced no significant consequences beyond the paltry $230 million fine, which was less than the profit it made in just the second fiscal quarter of 2023. This kind of pervasive corruption in both major parties and all branches and levels of government shouldn't be normalized, yet it receives very little media scrutiny apart from the coverage of particular scandals, which are often treated as isolated incidents instead of part of a wider pattern. And some things that should be scandals, such as Manchin using his position to enrich his corporate donors at the expense of frontline communities and all our shared planetary future, often aren't treated as scandals at all. Treatment of any illness has to start with a correct diagnosis. To save our planet and its most vulnerable people, Manchin's exit should spark a bigger conversation about the corruption that's become a defining feature of the U.S. political system. And that bigger conversation should focus around the Dump the Corruption campaign. It is obvious that Manchin never would have gotten where he has gotten if there had been an active Dump the Corruption movement. It is obvious that his possibility of getting to the presidency can be destroyed by a successful Dump the Corruption movement. We need to spark that bigger conversation, and we need to see to it that Manchin never gets to the White House, that Schumer gets kicked from his seat, and that all the people taking big money from the wealthy and corporate donors are kicked out of politics on their rear ends. And that's it for our second of our pieces today. Third thing that I wanted us to consider today was the recent interview by Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, of RFK Jr. So there I am. I'm not going to be able to go over this in detail. There isn't enough time. If I were going over it in detail, then it would not be possible to actually cover it, because the interview is itself 1 hour long. There were a few highlights of the interview, though, that I would like to cover. Let's look at this portion.
I'm all for a two-state solution. Show me how it happens. The last time that Arafat was offered that, which was by Clinton and Ehud Barak in 2001, he was offered everything that the Palestinians had asked for, everything, and except for 3% of the West Bank. And they said, we'll give you 3% of Israel. And those are the suburbs around major Israeli cities that are settled. Oh, and Arafat walked out of that negotiation without a counteroffer, and he later explained to Prince Bandar, if I made a deal, anybody who makes a deal with the Israelis, they will be killed by our own people.
So just to finish this up, sir.
They've been offered a two-state solution
She asked you about your end game. So I just want to get a definitive answer on that. She asked you about your end game, which is, let's say Israel
So Sagar lets him get away with that. Shouldn't have been allowed, to get away with that. Why? Because it's no longer 2003. And the situation that obtained in 2003 doesn't obtain in 2023. The Arabs have been through an additional 20 years, of suffering. The Israelis have just experienced some suffering and continue to experience it in this foolish war they're conducting, in Gaza. Even though the Netanyahu government may not be ready for negotiations, the Israeli people may be ready for negotiations. The West Bank, Palestinian people in the West Bank, may be ready for negotiations. The international community is certainly ready for negotiations and ready to support those inside of the United Nations in all kinds of ways, and outside of the United Nations within the BRICS group and within the developing multipolar world system. It is no longer 2003, and Yasser Arafat is no longer alive. Now Mahmoud Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, may be afraid of sitting down, to negotiate a peace. But there will be Palestinians who will not be afraid if the prize of peace is a two-state solution going back to the pre-1967 borders, before the 1967 war. If they think that, is the prize. Why is Bobby Kennedy not supporting a two-state solution on that particular basis? Why is he not criticizing the Netanyahu government for not having a ceasefire? Why is he not saying that if he were elected president, he would join with other leaders in the international system to propose that kind of solution and to impose it on the Israelis if necessary? Why isn't he saying he will use the full power of the United States to bring an end to that fighting? Keep that question in mind.
And we agreed there's no justification of Hamas. Hamas, a criminal enterprise, it's gone. What does a two-state solution look like under the Kennedy administration? The Biden administration is pushing the power.
That, by the way, is a perfectly legitimate question from Sagar, and a truly important question. Let's see how Bobby handles that.
Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu says no. So is that something that you envision?
Listen,
First of all, the
President of the United States cannot decree that, there's going to be a two-state solution.
The President of the United States can end all aid to Israel until the Israelis come out in support of a two-state solution and say they are willing to negotiate. That may not be a popular political position for Robert F. Kennedy to take, but when he says that the President of the United States cannot impose a two-state solution, the President of the United States can indeed impose such a solution on the Israelis. Now, maybe not on the Arabs, but the United States has considerable influence with many of the Arab states too, with Egypt, with Jordan, still with Saudi, with Qatar. Have I forgotten anybody? With many of the Arab states. If a leading candidate for the presidency of the United States says, I am in favor of a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 war borders, that's going to mean an awful lot in terms of world opinion. He can swing world opinion. He can get a tremendous amount of support from the progressives in this country for advocating for a ceasefire and advocating for that. He can do it if he wants to. Now, there will be some costs. Let's talk about those costs as we move along.
What we can do is we can pressure Israel, but more importantly, we can use our influence. I think what we need.
What does he mean by pressuring Israel? What I mean by pressuring Israel is threatening to cut off its aid by a date certain if they don't have an immediate ceasefire and they do not arrange to sit down with the Palestinians to negotiate a two-state solution based on the proposal that the 1967 borders be adopted. That is something the U.S. president can do. Biden won't do it. It is very significant to ask Barbie if he would do it if he were president. Now, he might lie about that and not do it even if he were president, but at a minimum, he has to state his intent to do something like that if we are really to consider him the peace candidate that he purports to be.
Need to be doing is to encouraging the Solomon Accords, encouraging peace in the.
What Solomon Accords? The Abraham Accords. There are no Solomon Accords. There are Abraham Accords. Is this just a slip of the tongue, or does it indicate he doesn't really know very much about the conflict, in the Middle East? I have to raise that question. Might be a slip of the tongue.
Region, encouraging ultimately peace is going to come from prosperity.
Would you condition aid to try to secure a two-state solution, or at
By the way, why didn't Crystal say, oh, you mean the Abraham Accords?
least to end the illegal settlements?
I would encourage it, but as I said, more importantly, I would encourage the other nations. I would be talking on the phone right now.
Why is it more important to encourage the other nations than it is to encourage Israel? What does he want to get the other nations to do? He wants to encourage them to sit down and talk to Israel and try to work through a solution. He should be trying to encourage the other nations to deny their oil to Israel, which, in spite of all the fuss they're making and all their tough talk, they have still not cut off the Israeli oil coming from Central Asia. With all the big talk of Turkey about all the troops they're going to send to Israel, they recently said they have 2 million troops ready to march to Israel in order to relieve the Gazans. But they don't need 2 million troops to cut off the oil. That would put an end to what the Israelis are doing in a relatively short time. Maybe that's what Bobby needs to encourage these other nations to do, to stop being hypocrites.
Now, with President Xi, with President Putin, with all the leaders of the Arab world, and trying to get some kind of collaboration, because I think ultimately that's what's going to happen. But until then, one of the problems, one of the dilemmas for Israel right now is you can say to Israel, let's turn this over.
So he wants everybody to come together, okay, to develop a solution. So do I. But that has to begin with a ceasefire right now. The president has the power to impose that ceasefire. Then everybody can be brought together with the principles, specifically the Palestinians, the Israelis, the PLO, and yes, perhaps even Hamas, to negotiate a peace and a security framework within which both the Israelis and the Arabs would be safe.
To the UN. The UN has never, the blue helmets have always left.
He's right. The blue helmets have very often left when the going got tough. But that doesn't have to be the case right now. That depends on the kinds of resolutions which the UN is willing to pass. And it depends on the makeup of the blue helmet forces, the size of those forces, and the capability of those particular sources. What are the various nations willing to do? We don't know what they're willing to do. But if you want a ceasefire that is going to last and a settlement that is going to last, then the blue helmets need to have the means and need to have the will to defend themselves in case of attacks, okay, from either side. Armed attacks from gangs, from settlers, from the Israeli Defense Forces, from the Israeli occupation forces, from the Hamas group, from other Palestinian resistance and or terrorist groupings. Of course, I have to point out here that by mentioning the various Israeli groupings, there's a strong argument for saying that they are terrorist groupings also. They certainly act like it. The settler groupings certainly act like it. The Israeli occupation forces often act like it. And what are the air attacks of the Israelis on Gaza right now? Except for the organized terrorism of a state violating international law, perpetrating ethnic cleansing on a virtually defenseless people. I'm not talking about Hamas now. The mass of Palestinians are defenseless people and cannot contest with the Israeli terror bombings. What are these terror bombings intended to do? We know because the Israelis have told us. They are intended to thin out the population of Gaza.
As soon as the shooting starts.
Sure.
And the UN will not.
Crystal and Saga don't contest with him on that. Obviously, I would have.
Not even condemn Hamas. So how is, and then the other Arab states have solidified, have all, expressed solidarity in support of Hamas. So how is Israel to, expect it now to turn its fate, its destiny, its duty to protect its own people from danger over to people who say, we don't think there's anything wrong with what Hamas did?
That is a strong man. What Bobby is being asked, to do is to support a ceasefire and then a negotiation for a solution that would bring forth a Palestinian state alongside, of the Israeli state. That doesn't mean that a settlement will be imposed on Israel that will endanger Israeli security. Of course, the Israelis think that just the establishment of the Palestinian state will endanger their security. But of course, the international community cannot allow the paranoids and the irrational fears of the Israelis to determine the solution. There has to be an attempt to construct a fair solution where both parties, are safe, and where both the Israelis and the Palestinians have a security framework which is reasonable and is backed by the whole international community. Not just the Arab states, but the whole international community has to be behind this, in the end. Because everybody stands to gain if we don't have these periodic risks to international peace coming out of Israel every 10 years.
All right, so let's move on to free speech. Just something.
So he was setting up a straw man there. I did not cover here the whole preceding part of this, in which Crystal grills Bobby on what his attitudes are towards Israel, towards the Palestinians, and towards the war, in Gaza. I therefore haven't commented on the numerous ridiculous statements that he made in that particular context. Crystal and Sagar do that actually fairly well. Though I have to say, I don't think they focused on international law enough. I don't think that they made Bobby see, that they made him see that there is no doubt that Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing tending towards genocide. And to make that clear once again, I will stop sharing this, though I will come back to it. And I'll once again share the article that I went over 2 programs ago, specifically the opinion piece published by Common Dreams, that was written by Farah Hassan, called Biden's Complicity in Gaza Violates international law. So Farah Hassan originally published, in other words, this piece on December 14th, 2023. And in the context of the piece, I just want to quote a few things. Palestinian human rights groups and many international experts, including Israeli scholars of the Holocaust, have warned that Israel's actions meet the legal standard, of genocide. Why wasn't Bobby confronted with that? Going on, Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention defines genocide as specific acts taken, quote, with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, unquote. With intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Isn't that what Israel is currently trying to do to the Palestinians in Gaza? Some of these acts include examples, quote, killing members of the group, unquote, quote, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, unquote, and, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I remind you at this point that Gazans are now being exposed to starvation as we speak. There is no food for many of them to eat each day. Food and water are getting scarcer and scarcer due to the military activities of the IDF. Also, according to Hassan, the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza's schools, also medical facilities, shelters, and residential areas are all evidence of likely genocidal acts, as are the forced relocation of over 1 million Palestinians out of northern Gaza and Israel's frequent bombing of civilian evacuation routes. Meanwhile, Israel has intensified its complete siege of Gaza, depriving Palestinians of food, water, electricity, fuel, and medical supplies. Starvation and infectious disease are rampant. Gaza's healthcare system has, quote, completely collapsed, unquote, from ongoing Israeli strikes, according to Doctors Without Borders. Proving genocidal intent can often be difficult, says Farah. However, experts have pointed to dehumanizing statements by Israeli leaders that hint at it, including calling Palestinians, quote, human animals, unquote, and, quote, children of darkness, unquote. Others are more explicit. An Israeli lawmaker called for a Nakba, an Arabic reference to the violent mass displacement of Palestinians that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. The defense minister declared, quote, we will eliminate everything, unquote, in Gaza. And a recent investigation by the Israeli Plus 972 magazine found that Israel's bombing of non-military targets is calculated. And the final paragraph I will read here. Many experts believe that these actions and statements of intent are evidence of an unfolding genocide due to the crime's gravity. All parties to the Genocide Convention, including the United States, have a legal duty to prevent it from the moment they learn of a serious risk that a genocide will be committed. So I have to ask, why wasn't this or similar articles or similar statements read to Bobby Kennedy during this interview? And why wasn't he then asked the question, do you believe the Israelis are well into the process of genocide, of the Palestinians? And if not, why not? Do you believe that these acts that have been described are being committed by the Israelis? And do you understand that they fit tightly the definition of genocide that we have read? Why wasn't he asked questions like that? And then why wasn't he asked, how can you support an ongoing genocide? Or should we ask, do you support an ongoing genocide in Gaza? He was never confronted with that by Crystal and Sager. He was confronted with the bombings and the damage being done by the bombings. Yes, he was confronted with that. They did a good job on that. But they didn't go the whole way, confronting him with international law and the Genocide Convention and the comparison of the acts of the Israelis. And that was, I believe, a fault with this particular interview, a very serious one. One friend of mine, in fact, thinks that Bobby should have been confronted with the statements of the Pope and then asked, as a religious Catholic whose faith is strong,
Strict.
does he agree with the Pope on this matter of what is going on in Gaza? He should have been hit with that. So now the interview moves to the issues of free speech. he should have been called out on that, because even though Israel doesn't have an established religion explicitly and specifically, there are laws in Israel that have been passed, especially in recent years, which make the Arab citizens of Israel second-class citizens, distinctly second-class citizens. There are laws that put Christian citizens of Israel at a disadvantage compared to the Jewish citizens, of Israel. There are laws that advantage the settlers in the occupied areas over Israeli citizens. The settlers have more legal privileges, even though they don't even live in Israel, over the Palestinian citizens of Israel who have lived there from the beginning. But as we proceed here, so it doesn't have an official religion, but Israel is officially a Jewish state. What does that mean, Bobby? And what does that mean? It's talking out of both sides of your face. Of course, the Israelis have established the Jewish religion over others. It may not be quite as much a state religion as Islam is in some of the Arab states, but it has been moving towards that over time. Israel was far more secular in the early days of Israel than it is now. And any honest person would recognize that, and would recognize the trends inside of Israel that disempower and disenfranchise the minorities in that particular state. I have to say, as a secular Jew, I really resent that. I resent the establishment of the religion. I have to say, I resent it from the first when Israel was established as a state. Okay, I was 9 years old at that time, and I was old enough to recognize that the compromise with the religious groups in Israel by the government of instituting kosher laws as mandatory inside of Israel, I considered that to be an oppressive thing to do, to make it mandatory. I've always thought that keeping the kosher laws should be a private thing. And yet, from the very first in Israel, that was mandated because the religious conservatives demanded it. They don't live according to the original charter. They've been modifying it as they go along. They operate on the British model. That is to say, you change the Constitution by changing the fundamental laws. Those changes have been subject to judicial review, but recently the Netanyahu administration has severely constrained the role of the judicial branch of government in ruling out laws that it finds to be obnoxious or against the Constitution. So, the executive branch has gained much more power over that recently, okay, in Israel. And that is bad news for the minorities and bad news for secular politics inside of Israel, okay, as well. And bad news for individual freedom as well, because more and more a religious kind of orthodoxy is being imposed on the citizens of Israel. Okay, so with respect to this part of the interview, I thought Crystal and Sagar did a very good job. Okay, I also thought that Bobby Kennedy, in his responses, maintained okay, his image as someone who would be a defender, okay, of free speech, even in circumstances where, okay, it hurts. And I think this has been one of the strongest aspects of his run for the presidency and his campaign, his insistence on the importance of free speech and free press, okay, for democracy. Okay, and I presume free assembly also, though he hasn't been that clear when it comes to free assembly. There's one more thing I wanted to cover before I sign off, and I'm not sure, okay, exactly where it is, but I may easily be able to find it here. He discusses abortion and housing, and okay, then they get to his VP picks, and they kid around about that. And he doesn't want to tell anybody who he favors, okay, for VP. The Epstein issue is brought up because he went on one of Epstein's planes twice, or Epstein's plane twice, but evidently never went, okay, to the island. Some people reviewing this interview have said that there's some smoke there, there might be fire too. But there was one thing towards the end, it was very short, they were rushing to get it done. I hope I haven't gone over it already. Yeah, they kept the whole thing there. So I'm going to play the last few minutes and looking for it for minute 56. They get specifically to the issue of the filibuster. Okay, I cannot find it. I should have been more careful in noting it the first time. I remember it, though, very well. He was asked, okay, the question of whether he would support by getting rid of the filibuster. And in reply to that, he made, okay, the outrageous comment, I thought it was, okay, an outrageous comment, saying that he didn't want to support the efforts uh, to get rid of the filibuster because he said something like, I value, okay, our democratic institutions. So he was saying, since the filibuster is one of our democratic institutions, I shouldn't be trying to get rid of it. And I thought that was totally ridiculous because the filibuster is one of the most undemocratic institutions inside of our government. It's the institution that is blocking democracy. But even more, from a practical point of view, here's a man who is coming to us, coming to the people of the United States, and he is saying, I want to put in more regulation. I want to get rid of money in politics. I want to end the corruption in our government. I want to give us an environment that's healthy and that's safe and that is livable. I want to restore the civil liberties and the civil rights of Americans. I'm also the peace candidate. I want to end all kinds of conflicts. So he's talking about the need for legislation in each of these areas. He's implicitly talking, if he's talking safeguards of free speech and safeguards of voting rights and the defeat of corruption, in our government. He's talking about things that are going to need some legislation. And he is facing a Congress that is thoroughly bought by corruption, facing a House thoroughly bought by corruption, facing a Senate thoroughly bought by corruption. How can he possibly get these implied laws through that he wants to get through if he doesn't get rid of the filibuster in the Senate? The filibuster is one of the leading institutions that stop good laws in these areas from being passed, good changes being made. On earlier occasions, he has said that in principle he is for Medicare for all. But if he became president, he doesn't think he would work for it because it's too heavy a lift. Why is it too heavy a lift? It's too heavy a lift because of the corruption. He knows that it's too heavy a lift because of the corruption. How does he propose to pass any laws to get rid of corruption without getting rid of the filibuster, in the Senate? A lot of candidates in recent years have come to us and they've promised this and they've promised that and they've promised the other thing to us. And they've said days for rise in the minimum wage. and they're for this thing, and they're for that thing, and for everything but the kitchen sink. And they never tell us how they're going to get rid of the filibuster and the other features of the federal government that are sustaining the corruption. How did they dare to tell us about all their wonderful plans and not tell us how they intend to defeat the special interests who are stopping laws like that, okay, from going through? So I'm sorry I wasn't able to find that very short passage for you. It was a very short passage. I should have marked it off. I was remiss in not actually doing that. But that's what he said about, okay, the filibuster. He also said a little something else, okay, which I forget now, but which in context was a ridiculous thing to say. His answer on the filibuster was brief. It didn't occupy a lot of the interview, but it was important because if he follows through on the opinions he expressed there, he would render himself helpless to do anything of value for the long run, okay, for the United States. That position on the filibuster is a deal breaker. It is a total deal breaker. It means he could never get, okay, to Medicare for all. He could never get to the bills needed to meet the climate emergency that we all face. It means he could not improve the environment in the way he wants to improve the environment. Taking a position like that renders him a fake and a fraud and a phony. And that's what I have to say about that. So, I'm going to take your comments now. Terry Cook says, if you stay positive in a negative situation, you win. Not always, Terry. Kay Ryan says, ho, Joe. Kay says, no cuts. Robert Copeland says, interesting topic tonight. Ed Walker joined. Ed Walker. That name is familiar to me from Fire Dog Lake. He was a wonderful blogger, okay, at Fire Dog Lake. I forget his pen name there, though. It will probably come to me, okay, in a moment or two. Okay, maybe he will grace us, okay, with his pen name so I can fully remember it. Robert Copeland says, if Manchin runs for president, he will take a lot of money from fossil fuel companies. K. Ryan says, my internet is in and out again. D says, hello, everyone listening in tonight. K says, hi, D, glad to see you. D says, how are you tonight, K? K says, okay, I guess. Andy Kenny says, very late, baby stressing with teeth again, Joe. No one can hear the sound of the video. All we see or hear is why 9U Joe can D call you to let you know. Still no dice. Well, I'm out of here, but I love you all. Andy Candy says, I only like Cornell so far. I was not aware that anything happened to my sound. I will double check my video after we're done to see if the sound, okay, has disappeared. As far as I know, there's nothing wrong with the sound that I can see. So, thank you all. I'm going to say good night now. And I will check on the sound to see what happened to it, of course. I'm very concerned about that. Anyway, good night.